Mark sat in the plush leather chair of Richard Hamilton's office, staring at his boss across the desk. For over 30 years, he had dedicated his life to the company, climbing the corporate ladder, working late nights, and making sacrifices that others never understood. Mark had given his best, believing that one day he would reap the rewards of his dedication. But now, all that seemed like a distant dream. Richard Hamilton, the man he had respected and trusted, sat there with a smug look on his face, as if delivering this news were nothing more than a routine business transaction. "Mark, I'm sorry, but we're downsizing. I'm going to have to let you go," Richard said, his voice sharp and without any emotion. His words cut through the silence like a knife, leaving Mark stunned. For a moment, Mark couldn't move. The world around him seemed to blur, the room shrinking as he tried to process what he had just heard. 30 years. 30 years of loyalty and hard work, and it all boiled down to a single sentence. A sentence delivered with cold detachment. "You're fired," Richard repeated, not even bothering to look Mark in the eye. Mark's throat tightened. The anger that was slowly bubbling inside him was threatening to explode, but he fought to keep his composure. He had always prided himself on being professional, even in the toughest situations. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. "What about my severance? My retirement plan? I've worked here my whole life, Richard." "I deserve something," Mark said, his voice quivering with disbelief. Richard merely waved his hand dismissively. "Don't take it personally, Mark. It's just business. The company is moving in a new direction. Nothing personal." The words stung, but what hurt more was the coldness with which Richard said them. There was no empathy, no gratitude for everything Mark had done. It was as if he had never mattered at all. Mark's mind raced with thoughts of how everything he had built, the long hours, the sacrifices, the loyalty, meant nothing to this man. He wanted to shout, to tell Richard exactly what he thought of him, but Mark held back. He had spent years in the corporate world, learning when to fight and when to walk away. This was one of those times where walking away would give him the upper hand. With his fists clenched tightly at his sides, Mark stood up from the chair. His legs felt heavy, as if the weight of the world had just been placed on his shoulders. Without saying another word, he turned and walked out of Richard's office, out of the building, and into the cold, unforgiving world outside. As the door closed behind him, Mark felt a pang of finality. This was the end of an era, the end of his career. But even as he stepped onto the street, his heart filled with a strange mixture of anger and resolve. He didn't know what was next, but one thing was clear. Richard Hamilton had made a grave mistake. And Mark would make sure that mistake would cost him everything. The week that followed was a blur of confusion, anger, and disbelief. Mark spent countless hours staring at the walls of his house, trying to come to terms with what had happened. His wife, Anna, had done her best to comfort him, but even she couldn't hide her concern. They had bills to pay, a mortgage, and their son's tuition looming on the horizon. Everything seemed to be spiraling out of control, and Mark felt more lost than ever. But one afternoon, as he sat in his home office, trying to muster the courage to update his resume, something caught his eye. A folder, buried deep at the back of a drawer, had been there for years. He had almost forgotten about it. It wasn't labeled, and it had no particular significance at first glance. But something about it felt important. Curious, Mark pulled it out and began to go through the contents. Inside, he found a series of pay stubs, time cards, and email correspondence dating back to the very beginning of his tenure at Hamilton and Company. At first, he wasn't sure what he was looking at. But as he read through the documents, his blood ran cold. There it was. The truth. Richard Hamilton had been stealing from him, manipulating his hours, and refusing to pay him for overtime. For 30 years, Mark had worked tirelessly, giving everything to the company. Yet Richard had systematically underpaid him, pocketing millions in the process. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he sifted through the evidence. It was irrefutable. There were discrepancies in the pay stubs, time cards showing that he had worked overtime for which he was never compensated. Richard had even sent emails directing his managers to avoid paying Mark the overtime he was entitled to. It was all there, laid out before him in black and white. At first, Mark couldn't believe what he was seeing. He triple-checked the numbers, recalculated the figures, and cross-referenced the documents. But there was no denying it. Richard Hamilton, the man he had trusted for so long, had been stealing from him for decades. The anger that Mark had been holding back now boiled over. This wasn't just about money. It was about betrayal. It was about the years of hard work, the personal sacrifices, and the loyalty he had shown, only to be repaid with lies and deceit. But Mark wasn't about to let Richard get away with it. This was no longer about getting his job back or finding another job in the corporate world. This was about justice. Mark knew that the documents in front of him were just the tip of the iceberg. Richard Hamilton had built his empire on lies, and Mark now had a weapon to bring it all crashing down. But as he stared at the evidence, he realized that taking action wouldn't be simple. Richard wasn't just a businessman. He was a ruthless corporate titan who wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone who dared to challenge him. Mark spent the next few days planning his next move. He knew he had to be careful. If he made one wrong move, Richard could easily discredit him, label him as a disgruntled employee, and have him silenced before he could even get a foot in the courtroom. Mark couldn't afford to be reckless. This was no longer just about getting revenge. It was about playing a dangerous game of strategy. He began by contacting a lawyer who specialized in corporate fraud. The lawyer, a sharp and seasoned professional named Claire Adams, listened to Mark's story carefully. She didn't seem shocked by the details, as if corporate malfeasance was something she had encountered many times before. But what struck Mark was her calm and calculating demeanor. "Mark, I've seen cases like this before," Claire said, her voice steady. "But you're not just up against a corrupt executive. You're up against an entire system. One that's designed to protect people like Richard. It's going to be tough, but we can take him down." The words were comforting, but Mark knew the road ahead would be long and perilous. Claire outlined a plan. First, they would need to gather more evidence, more witnesses who could corroborate his story. But this wasn't going to be a simple case of getting Richard fired and hoping for the best. No, Mark wanted to see him pay for what he had done, not just to him, but to countless others. They set up a meeting with a former employee of Hamilton and Company, someone who had worked in the finance department and had witnessed Richard's underhanded dealings firsthand. The employee, a woman named Susan, was hesitant at first. She had left the company years ago, but the memories of the corruption she had seen still haunted her. Mark didn't pressure her. He simply listened as she recounted the many times Richard had manipulated the system for his own gain. Susan's testimony would be crucial, but Mark knew it was still not enough. They needed more. They needed hard evidence, something irrefutable that would expose Richard's corruption to the public. Mark and Claire began to look deeper into Hamilton and Company's financial records, focusing on the areas where Richard had stolen the most. They dug through years of tax filings, pay records, and company reports, looking for anything that could tie Richard directly to the fraud. But they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time they made progress, it felt as though someone was one step ahead of them. One evening, Mark received an anonymous tip, an encrypted email that contained a file he wasn't expecting. The message simply read, "You're getting too close. Be careful." Inside the file was a list of names, people who had been involved in the cover-up of Richard's crimes. Some of the names were familiar, others were people Mark had never heard of. But one name stood out: Greg Daniels. Greg had been a close friend of Mark's, someone he had trusted over the years. It was unsettling to see Greg's name on the list. Mark had to wonder, had Greg been complicit in Richard's schemes all along? Or had he been coerced into helping cover up the truth? The more Mark dug, the more he realized that this wasn't just a battle between him and Richard. It was a fight against an entire network of corruption. People he had once considered friends were now potential enemies. And Mark had to be prepared for whatever they might throw at him. As Mark and Claire pushed forward with their investigation, the weight of what they were uncovering began to settle heavily on Mark's shoulders. The world he had once known, the world of corporate power, sleek offices, and high-end suits, was nothing more than a facade, a mask that hid a grotesque underbelly of deceit, manipulation, and exploitation. With every document they unearthed, with every conversation they had, Mark's conviction grew stronger. Richard Hamilton had built an empire on the backs of those he had exploited, and now, it was time to tear it all down. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, a new question emerged. Who could Mark truly trust? The anonymous tip-off had left him questioning everyone, especially Greg. Mark's former friend had always been a part of his inner circle, but now, Mark couldn't help but wonder if Greg had been involved all along. Had Greg known about Richard's fraudulent activities? Was he protecting Richard, or was he just another pawn in the corporate game? Determined to find out, Mark decided to confront Greg directly. It wasn't a decision he made lightly, but Mark needed answers. The meeting took place in a quiet cafe, far from the corporate world that had been their shared battleground for years. Greg seemed uneasy from the moment Mark sat down across from him. His usual easygoing demeanor was replaced by a tense, almost nervous energy. "Mark, what's going on?" Greg asked, his voice unsteady. "You've been acting strange lately." Mark didn't beat around the bush. He came straight to the point. "Greg, I know you're involved in this," Mark said, his voice calm but unwavering. "I know about the files, the names, and the corruption. You're protecting Richard, aren't you?" Greg's face drained of color. For a moment he didn't speak, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Mark could see the fear in his eyes. It was clear now. Greg was hiding something. The question was, what? "Mark, you don't understand," Greg finally whispered, his voice shaking. "I didn't have a choice. Richard. He has dirt on me. He has control over everything. If I don't play along, he'll destroy me." Mark's heart sank as he processed Greg's words. He had known Richard to be ruthless, but this was on an entirely different level. Richard didn't just manipulate people. He owned them. He had built a system where everyone was either bought or blackmailed into silence. It was no wonder that so many people had turned a blind eye to his actions. They were afraid. And who could blame them? "You should have come to me," Mark said, his voice softening. "You didn't have to do this alone." Greg's expression hardened. "And what would you have done, Mark? You think you can just take down Richard? He's untouchable." Mark's eyes burned with determination. "He's not untouchable. And I'll make sure everyone knows the truth." But Greg wasn't finished. He leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Be careful, Mark. There are people involved in this who will stop at nothing to protect Richard. You're playing a dangerous game, and you might not make it out alive." The words hit Mark like a cold wave. He had always known that exposing Richard would come with risks, but hearing it from someone so close to him, someone who knew Richard's power firsthand, made the danger feel real. Mark stood up, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. He had come here for answers, and now he had them. But the more he learned, the more dangerous this mission became. It wasn't just about exposing Richard anymore. It was about survival. As Mark left the cafe, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was another anonymous message. "Stop digging, Mark. You're treading on dangerous ground. The people you're up against are watching." Mark's heart skipped a beat. The game had changed. The stakes were no longer just about taking down a corrupt CEO. They were about staying alive long enough to see justice served. Mark sat alone in his apartment, the weight of his discovery pressing heavily on his chest. The conversation with Greg had shaken him more than he had expected. He had always trusted Greg, considered him a friend, but now it seemed like the very foundation of his life was crumbling beneath him. The files Claire had uncovered were damning, but the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. Mark's phone buzzed again. Another anonymous message. "Time is running out, Mark. They're coming for you." His stomach churned. The threat was real, and he could no longer ignore it. The people who had been pulling the strings from the shadows were closing in, and Mark could feel their presence looming over him, just beyond the edge of his vision. He glanced at the stack of documents in front of him, the evidence of Richard Hamilton's empire of corruption, and felt a surge of determination. He wasn't going to stop. No matter how dangerous it got, he would bring Richard down. He had to. There were too many lives at stake now. But Mark knew that if he continued down this path, there was no turning back. Richard's reach was vast, and Mark was only beginning to see the full extent of the web he had woven. The people Richard had surrounded himself with, his loyal underlings, his powerful allies, had all been carefully positioned to protect him. It wasn't just about one corrupt CEO anymore. It was about an entire system, a system that would do whatever it took to maintain its grip on power. As Mark stared at the phone in his hand, another message popped up, this time from Claire. "We need to talk. It's bigger than we thought. We've uncovered something. Something dangerous." The hairs on the back of Mark's neck stood on end. It was the first time Claire had used the word dangerous. He had to meet her. They had no time to waste. Mark grabbed his coat and rushed out of the apartment, knowing that every moment brought him closer to the inevitable confrontation. When he arrived at the small nondescript office building where Claire had set up their base of operations, she was waiting for him in the dimly lit room, her face pale and tense. "Mark," Claire said, her voice shaking. "I don't know how to say this, but we've uncovered something huge. Richard has connections. People who are involved in more than just corporate corruption. There's a network of people, powerful people, who are doing things. Things that go far beyond what we ever imagined." Mark felt his pulse quicken. He had known Richard was dangerous, but this was something entirely different. If what Claire was saying was true, then they weren't just up against a corrupt businessman. They were up against an entire network of criminal activity. "Claire, what are you talking about?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Claire glanced around the room, as if checking for any eavesdroppers. She leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Richard is involved in illegal arms deals, money laundering, and even human trafficking. He's using his company as a front to move goods and launder money. But it doesn't stop there. He's part of something much bigger. Something global. We're not just dealing with corporate greed anymore, Mark. We're dealing with organized crime on an international scale." Mark felt the floor beneath him shift. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about exposing a criminal empire that reached far beyond the boardrooms and high-rise offices. They were about to take on forces far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. "How did you find this out?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible. "We traced the financial records," Claire replied. "There are transactions that don't make sense. Money moving through shell companies, fake accounts, and suspicious connections to known criminal organizations. It's all connected, Mark. Richard is at the center of it, and the people he's working with, they'll stop at nothing to protect him." Mark ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. This was bigger than he had ever imagined, and yet, it felt like they had no choice but to continue. If they backed down now, everything they had uncovered would be buried forever. Richard Hamilton would remain untouchable, and countless more would suffer at his hands. "Claire, we have to bring this to the authorities," Mark said, his voice firm. "This can't be ignored. We have to expose everything." Claire hesitated. "I don't know, Mark. If we go public with this, Richard has too many connections. We could be putting ourselves in danger. This is bigger than just the two of us." Mark looked into Claire's eyes and saw the fear there, but also the same determination that burned inside him. They had come too far to back down now. This was their fight, and they had to see it through, no matter the cost. "We've already come this far, Claire. We can't stop now. We have to finish what we started." Before Claire could respond, Mark's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. He didn't recognize the number, but something told him it was important. "Hello." Mark answered, his voice tense. "Mark," the voice on the other end said, calm and cold. "You've been digging in places you shouldn't. You need to stop now. If you don't, there will be consequences. We've been watching you." The line went dead. Mark stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. The threat was real, and it was clear that whoever was behind this wouldn't stop until he was silenced. But Mark wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The city streets were quiet as Mark made his way back to his apartment, his mind spinning from the phone call. The warning had been clear, chilling. Someone powerful was watching his every move. The message was simple: stop investigating, or face the consequences. But Mark wasn't ready to back down. Not when the truth was so close. He needed more evidence, something irrefutable, something that would make Richard and his network of criminals tremble. But what? The walls seemed to be closing in around him, and every corner he turned seemed to present more risks than solutions. He unlocked the door to his apartment and stepped inside, his thoughts racing. As he closed the door behind him, he noticed something different. His desk was covered in a thick layer of dust, but there was a small, neatly folded note placed in the center of his desk. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He unfolded the note with trembling hands. The words were simple, but they were enough to send a shiver down his spine. "Your time is running out. If you want to survive, leave now. Leave everything behind. It's not worth it." It was a warning. A threat. But Mark wasn't sure who had left it. Was it Richard's people, or someone else? Someone who didn't want the truth to come out? He glanced around the room, searching for anything unusual, but everything seemed in its place. The only thing that felt out of place was the note. The phone in his pocket buzzed again. This time it was Claire. "Mark, we need to talk. It's urgent. Meet me at the usual place." He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket and left, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had no choice but to see Claire. Whatever she had discovered, it could be the key to taking down Richard once and for all. When he arrived at the small cafe where Claire had been hiding out, she was already sitting at their usual table, her eyes scanning the room nervously. As soon as she saw him, she stood up, a look of panic on her face. "Mark, I've been trying to reach you," Claire said, her voice frantic. "I found something big. Richard's been trying to cover his tracks, but I found a list of names. People who've been working with him. People who've been part of his network for years. It's all linked to high-level politicians, law enforcement, even some military contacts. This isn't just corporate corruption, it's a full-blown conspiracy." Mark's stomach churned. He had suspected it was bad, but this was worse than he could have imagined. The list of names was a direct link to powerful figures in society, people who had the resources and connections to bury the truth forever. "We need to get this information out there," Mark said, his voice firm. "If we expose this, it's over for Richard and his network. They won't be able to cover it up." "I don't know if we can do that, Mark," Claire replied, her voice filled with doubt. "These people are dangerous. If we go public with this, they'll come after us. And I don't think we're ready for that kind of fight. We need a plan. We need backup." Mark thought for a moment, then nodded. "We'll figure it out. But we can't back down now. We're so close." Claire looked down at the table, visibly shaken. "Mark, there's more. One of the names on the list. It's someone close to us. Someone who's been feeding information to Richard. Someone we trust." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" he asked, dreading the answer. Claire's eyes met his, and for the first time, Mark saw the fear in her gaze. "It's Greg," she whispered. The name hit Mark like a punch to the gut. Greg. The one person he had always relied on, the person he thought was on their side. The person he had considered his closest friend. "Are you sure?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. Claire nodded, her face pale. "I've been digging into Greg's finances, his connections, and I found something. A series of wire transfers from Richard's companies to Greg's account. He's been taking money from Richard for months. I don't know how deep he's involved, but he's connected." Mark's mind reeled. Greg, the one person he had trusted above all others, had been betraying him from the start. But why? What was his motivation? Was Greg just another victim of Richard's manipulation, or was he a willing accomplice? Why would he do this? Mark muttered to himself, more to himself than to Claire. "I don't know," Claire replied. "But we need to be careful. If Greg's involved, he could be working against us, and we can't trust him anymore." Mark sat back in his chair, trying to process everything Claire had just told him. He had thought he was getting closer to the truth, but now it felt like he was walking in a maze with no clear way out. Just then, Mark's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging, Mark. You've gone too far. If you don't stop now, you'll regret it." Mark looked up at Claire, his expression grim. "It's getting worse. Whoever's behind this, they're not going to stop. We're in this too deep now, Claire. There's no turning back." Claire nodded, her face determined but fearful. "We have to keep going, Mark. For the truth. For everyone who's been hurt by Richard and his network." They both knew it wasn't going to be easy. But Mark was more certain than ever that they couldn't stop now. They had come too far. The tipping point had been reached, and there was no turning back. The following days felt like a blur to Mark. Every move he made, every phone call he received, seemed to carry a weight he couldn't escape. The walls of his world were closing in around him, and trust had become a fragile thing, easily shattered. He couldn't stop thinking about Greg. Was he really involved? Was everything they had shared a lie? The doubt gnawed at him relentlessly. Claire had gone silent for a few hours after the revelation about Greg. She said she needed time to think, to figure out their next move. But Mark knew time was running out. They couldn't afford to wait. The network of corruption was vast, and Richard's influence was tightening its grip on everything. They had to act fast. Mark's phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Claire. "Mark, we need to meet," she said urgently. "I've found something. Something that could change everything." He didn't hesitate. He knew she wouldn't call unless it was important. They agreed to meet in the same cafe they had met before. Mark was already halfway there when his phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Greg. It was short, almost too casual. "Mark, we need to talk. There's a lot you don't know. Let's meet." Mark's stomach twisted. He had hoped he was wrong about Greg. But this message, it was a red flag. He hadn't spoken to Greg in days. He thought he could trust him, but now everything was clouded in doubt. Arriving at the cafe, he saw Claire sitting by the window, her eyes scanning the door as if she was waiting for someone, or watching for danger. Mark joined her quickly, sitting across from her. Her face was pale, the urgency in her eyes unmistakable. "I've been digging more into Greg," Claire said, her voice tense. "And I found something that links him directly to Richard. I've got proof, Mark. I've been following his movements, looking into his associates, and it's all connected. He's been meeting with Richard's people for weeks now, and I've seen wire transfers between him and one of Richard's shell companies." Mark's mind raced. Greg, the man who had always been there for him, had been playing both sides. But why? What does he want? Mark asked, his voice low. "I don't know," Claire replied, her eyes filled with frustration. "But whatever it is, it's deeper than we thought. I think Richard has something over Greg. Maybe he's been blackmailed, maybe he's just too far in now to back out. But one thing is clear. Greg isn't on our side anymore." Mark sat back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. He had trusted Greg with everything. And now, it seemed that trust had been his biggest mistake. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of betrayal. Greg wasn't just a colleague. He was his friend. How could someone so close to him be a part of this web of corruption? Just then, Mark's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from the unknown number. "You're running out of time. Greg's been working with us all along. You'll never be able to stop what's coming." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He looked up at Claire, his face grim. "This is it. It's all out in the open now." Claire nodded slowly. "We can't trust anyone anymore, Mark. Not even Greg. If we're going to take Richard down, we have to do it without him." "But how?" Mark asked. "We're running out of options. The more we uncover, the more dangerous this gets. If Richard's network is as big as we think, we don't have the resources to fight it." "We'll have to find a way," Claire said, her voice firm. "But first, we need to meet with someone who can help us. Someone who has the power to take down Richard's operation. I've been in touch with a source. Someone high up who wants to see Richard fall as much as we do. But we can't do this alone. We need the right people, the right plan." Mark thought for a moment. He didn't want to trust anyone anymore, not after everything that had happened. But Claire was right. They couldn't do this alone. If they were going to take Richard down, they needed all the help they could get. "I'll meet them," Mark said finally. "But if we do this, there's no turning back. Once we expose Richard's operation, there's no way to hide from the fallout." Claire gave him a determined nod. "We're in this together, Mark. No turning back now." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them aware of the enormity of what they were about to face. Richard's network was vast, but with the right people, they might have a chance. But the stakes had never been higher. Just then, Mark's phone buzzed again. It was an encrypted message from the same unknown number. "It's already started, Mark. You're too late." Mark's blood ran cold. The feeling of dread that had been building for weeks now consumed him entirely. He looked up at Claire, his expression dark. "I think it's already begun." The atmosphere in the cafe felt suffocating. Every moment Mark spent sitting across from Claire, the weight of what they were about to do pressed heavier on his chest. The message from the unknown number kept echoing in his mind. "It's already started, Mark. You're too late." Was it a threat? Or a warning? Either way, the tension was undeniable. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. "We need to meet the contact," Claire said, breaking the silence. Her eyes were sharp, determined. "We need to do this now, before things get any worse." Mark nodded, though his heart was pounding. He didn't know who to trust anymore. He'd thought he could trust Greg. He'd thought he could trust Richard. But the truth had unraveled everything. Now, the only thing left to do was fight back. They left the cafe and drove to the location Claire had arranged. An old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was isolated, hidden from prying eyes. As they arrived, Mark felt the familiar chill of dread creep up his spine. He glanced at Claire, who seemed calm despite the gravity of their situation. "Who's this contact of yours?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Someone high up," Claire replied cryptically. "A former associate of Richard. They've been watching his every move for months, waiting for the right moment to strike. They're in a position to take him down, but they need us to make the first move. Together, we can expose everything." Mark was unsure. It felt like every step they took led them deeper into danger. But he trusted Claire, and in that moment, it was all he had left. They entered the warehouse, greeted by the harsh sound of footsteps echoing across the empty space. A man in a black suit stood waiting for them, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. The silence between them was palpable, as though they were all aware that this was the moment that would determine everything. "You must be Mark and Claire," the man said, his voice low and steady. "I've been expecting you. There's no time to waste." Claire stepped forward. "We need to bring Richard down. We have the evidence, but we need your help to expose him to the world." "We can't do it alone." The man nodded, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed them. "I know who Richard is. I've seen what he's done. And I've been waiting for someone to take him down. But you must understand, this won't be easy. Richard has connections everywhere. He's untouchable in many circles. If we move now, it could set off a chain of events we can't control." "We don't have a choice," Mark said, his voice firm. "He's already starting to cover his tracks. If we wait any longer, he'll disappear, and all of this will be for nothing." The man studied Mark for a long moment, then sighed. "Very well. We move tonight." They made their way to a secure location, where the final pieces of the puzzle were laid out. The man had connections in high places, journalists, government officials, even law enforcement, and with their help, they could expose Richard's empire for what it was. But as the plan began to unfold, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They were on the verge of victory, but Richard's network was vast. Mark had already lost one person he trusted, Greg, and he couldn't afford to lose anyone else. Not now. As the hours passed, the plan took shape. A carefully crafted message was set to be broadcast to the world, exposing Richard's operation in one swift blow. All they had to do was push a button, and the truth would be unleashed. Mark's hands trembled as he stared at the screen in front of him, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. Would this finally be the end of Richard's reign? At that moment, Mark received a final message from the unknown number. "You think you've won, Mark. But you're too late. It's already over." Mark's heart skipped a beat. The message was a warning, but there was something else, a sense of finality, as if Richard had already anticipated their move. The words echoed in his mind as Claire and the man from the warehouse prepared to go live with the broadcast. "We need to move now," the man said, urgency creeping into his voice. "Once we release this, there's no going back. Richard will know we're coming for him." Mark nodded, his mind racing. It was now or never. They pressed the button. The broadcast went live. For a moment, nothing happened. The world didn't stop. No sirens, no chaos. Just the cold clinical truth flashing across screens worldwide. Richard's corruption, his network, his every move, exposed. And yet, even as Mark felt the smallest flicker of relief, there was a deep gnawing feeling in his gut. Had they really won? The finality of it all hit him when the man's phone buzzed. He answered it immediately, his expression darkening with each word. "We've been compromised," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Richard's people are already moving. They know what we've done." Suddenly, the warehouse door slammed open. Men in suits stormed inside, guns drawn, eyes cold. Richard's people had found them. Mark turned to Claire, panic rising in his chest. "We need to go. Now." They ran for the back exit, the sound of pursuit growing louder with each passing second. But as they reached the door, Mark saw something that stopped him in his tracks. Greg. He was standing there in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Mark's heart sank. Had Greg been working with Richard all along? "Greg, what are you doing?" Mark demanded, voice cracking with disbelief. Greg's eyes flickered briefly with guilt, but then he stepped forward, his hand pulling something from his jacket. "I'm sorry, Mark," he said, his voice low. "I didn't have a choice." Before Mark could react, Greg raised the gun. Time seemed to slow. But in that instant, Claire lunged at Greg, knocking the gun from his hand. The two tumbled to the ground in a blur of motion. Mark could barely process what was happening. Claire was fighting Greg, desperately trying to disarm him, while Mark struggled to breathe, his mind unable to comprehend the betrayal. Then there was a sharp crack. The sound of a gunshot. Everything went silent. Mark rushed forward, but it was too late. Claire was lying on the ground, her blood staining the floor. Greg stood over her, a blank expression on his face. Mark's vision blurred with rage, grief, and disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. In the chaos, Mark managed to grab the gun, his hands trembling. He aimed it at Greg. There was no hesitation, no mercy. Only the cold, brutal finality of what had just happened. Bang! Greg crumpled to the ground. But as Mark stood over him, something in him died. He had won. But at what cost? The truth had been exposed, but the price was unimaginable. And as Mark looked down at the wreckage of everything he had once trusted, he realized that some victories were never truly worth winning.